Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. These days we are talking about the story of Pensacola and the railroad. And in our last episode we had talked about the early efforts to bring a railroad here, which were unsuccessful, this being in the 1830s. And then we picked up the story once again in the 1850s as efforts began to build a railroad between Pensacola and Pollard Junction to connect with a similar line being built northeast across Alabama. The Alabama-Florida Railroad indeed was successful in getting off the ground. It was being built and was almost complete when Florida seceded from the Union. And it was about 3 months away from actual operation when the Confederate States of America were formed and then when shooting began between North and South. The railroad itself was completed and began service here in June of 1861. Now, we have no clear picture of what the rail engines looked like and so forth, but this little painting which my grandson did up above me here shows the kind of engine that they might have had. They had graduated from the original configuration of the engine with 2 lead wheels and 2 drive wheels. We now are probably to the point where they had what they called a 4-4, which was 4 lead wheels and 4 drive wheels. They were not heavy, the engines and their loads were not heavy enough for trailing wheels as yet, but that's basically the kind of equipment that would have been here when the trains began to move back and forth north and south. Now in the period between June of 1861 and May of 1862, the railroad was used primarily for transporting troops back and forth and for sending materials that were made, manufactured, and sent north from the factories here. But unfortunately, because the North continued to hold Fort Pickens, the railroad was of no use at all in bringing supplies through the port and onto the Confederate cause. When the Confederates evacuated Pensacola in May of 1862, the railroad made its last run, and as it did so, they stopped about roughly every 100 yards. They stopped, tore up the tracks, took up the ties, burned them, put the rails on the top so they would bend and be useless to the Yankees. And so for basically the next 7.5 years, we had no railroad. All through the balance of the war, of course, Pensacola was much more or less a ghost town, and it took 3 years after the completion of hostilities before railroad building could resume again. But now, by 1868, there was enough energy here and the beginning of some revival that money was becoming available. And the city of Pensacola, which had been a major bondholder, literally stepped forward and was part of the mechanism here that created a new company which became known as the Pensacola and Louisville Railroad. It had some out-of-town bonding as well. We won't go into that whole story. But nonetheless, by the early part of 1871, the P&L was available and began to move. And of course, as it did so, it did connect with the completed railroad across Alabama, and by a happy coincidence, that railroad was usable just about the time that ice was available here and we could begin our commercial fishing industry. And of course, that was when the lumbering industry began, all sorts of other traffic began. So the railroad became an absolutely integral part of our economic system. It moved so quickly that just 3 years beyond this, a new railroad had to be constructed, or was constructed, between downtown Pensacola and the little lumbering village of Millville, just a little bit to the west of it, about 11 miles to the west. And the Pensacola and Perdido Railroad was built. It was basically the same kind of line, very, very simple equipment. It ran back and forth 3 times a day with a passenger coach, and most of the time their cartage was in lumber that was built, was formed by the Southern Straits Lumber Company and by the Ricks Robinson Lumber Company over at Millview. It would come in here and be unloaded and shipped out from the docks that the railroad built at the foot of C Street. So we have the P&P, we have the Pensacola and Louisville, and that's where things stood up until 1879. And at this point in time, there was another wave of things that began to move. This dealt with, of course, the fact that railroading was moving not just in our local area, of course, but all across the United States. We had just a few years before the first transatlantic railroad had been completed, and now people, both the states and the federal government were making huge grants of land to railroad companies if they would complete trackage across areas which were deemed to be desirable. And so the L&N Railroad, or one of its auxiliaries, began the planning of a line which would run from Pensacola to the east across the Panhandle to the Chattahoochee River, where it would be joined by another railroad being built west out of Jacksonville. So we would have a linkage right at the river. And of course, for a time, they had to use ferries to carry the cars back and forth, those that they transferred. But nonetheless, the railroad was begun. The man that was sent to build this, to superintend it in any event, was named William Dudley Chipley. And Chipley was joined by a man named Fred DeFuniak and by Richard Carey and F.E. Bonifay. This was a great railroading team, and their plan was to build this line to the east and to employ 6 different contracting companies, each one of whom would have a particular section to build. Well, when folks looked at it, they said, well, this is absolutely going to take forever, because look at the number of rivers and streams and marshes and swamps that they have to cross. It'll take forever. Chipley said no. He said this is now in the early part of 1880. He said no, we'll have that railroad functioning by the end of 1882. Well, he was wrong, because they did even better than that. The railroad was completed, did all of the things that they said it would do. The first trial run was done with a lot of dignitaries on board, slowly moving across the bridge that crossed the bay here. And by 1881, we had the Pensacola and Atlantic Railroad. Now, this was a unique thing. For one must just think a little bit about what that geography is like. In those days, if one got on his horse and rode from Pensacola to the Chattahoochee River, he would pass through Milton and basically nothing else. There were no other towns. This was blank, virgin territory. And the railroad, of course, was to get 23,000 acres for every mile of track they completed between point A and point B. That added up overall to a little bit more than 3 million acres. Now, the railroad is completed, it's there, but the question is, how are they going to use it to make money? How are they going to use it to develop the area? And so it's at this point that William Chipley and his associates began to do all sorts of wonderful things, at least wonderful for Pensacola, because they became our area's first real promoters. They began to send all sorts of literature. They make all sorts of special offers for people to come and see what a wonderful area this was. They printed literature that talked about the kinds of vegetables that could be raised here. And I must confess, they exaggerated a little bit. They showed watermelons like this and squash like that and grapes about this size. They made it look like almost anything would grow here, and people came and looked. And then in the early part of 1882, they had still another idea. By now, the idea of the Chautauqua had taken root up in New York State. And the Chautauqua, of course, was a summer-long program at which Cornell University, in the original form, had put together a team of specialists in all sorts of entertainment. They were singers and dancers and lecturers and all sorts of things. And people from all over came to the Chautauqua ceremonies. So William Chipley heard about it, and he said, we must have one of these here. And so they created the means of doing a Chautauqua show on the lake there at what was now to become the little village of DeFuniak Springs, which, by the way, was named for Fred DeFuniak, the chief engineer for the new railroad. Well, they didn't have any of the facilities there, so they put up large tents, almost like a circus. They ran railroad sleeping cars in there for the hotel, and they would do such things as offering a special deal. Now, let's pretend, for example, we're all sitting in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We pick up the Milwaukee Journal on a Sunday morning, and here's this ad which says, the railroad provides you round-trip rail fare, a hotel, admission to all of the entertainment that you can have there, a certain number of meals. This will all be done, all given to you for just $12. Well, people saw that, and they thought, well, this looks like a wonderful opportunity, and they came. And so this sort of thing was used to open up Pensacola as or rather Northwest Florida, as an area, and one item by item, the little towns began to be formed along the way. Most of them farm-to-market type villages. And because of the men who were involved in the railroad, Mr. Holt, Mr. Richard Carey for Caryville, DeFuniak, of course, for DeFuniak Springs, Chipley for Chipley Fort, Bonifay was the chief ticket master. So all of these towns were named for the men who literally were putting the railroad together, and it worked. Well, as all of this was done, of course, more people began to come, and this is right in the middle, right in the very heart of the lumbering era. So the railroad plus the existence of this new economic engine that Pensacola and the area had, everything everything was working just fine. Well, about this same time, the area was very fortunate in that two other men began to arrive here. One was named Henry McLaughlin, and the other was named Roy McGargle. Now, both of these men had worked on major railroads that were being built in the West. McLaughlin had been working primarily in Texas, McGargle with another function, and McGargle had, not only was he an engineer, but he also had very close economic ties to some people that, some of whom had a little bit of a shady reputation on Wall Street because they had done some rather unfair things with the stock of things like the Nickel Plate Road and the Erie. But nonetheless, McGargle had all of this know-how, and so he and McLaughlin came here, and they had a second dream. They had two additional dreams. One, they said, we need a railroad, or this area needs a railroad that will connect Pensacola with New Orleans. And then secondly, this whole area needs a rail line that will move out of here, move north, through Muskogee, and then on north further into Mississippi, and then to ultimately connect with Memphis and St. Louis. This was their dream. And so in the early part of the 1890s, the financing was in place, and they began what became known as the Pensacola, Mobile, and New Orleans Railroad. It was to run almost due west from here with a dock in the downtown area. And the railroad, they built about 25 miles of that line going due west. They were surveyed all the way to Mobile, and of course they had land rights plans for the extension on to New Orleans. Unfortunately, as time passed, the financing ran out, and the other opportunities came along for transportation. And so while the Pensacola, Mobile, and New Orleans was built for about 35 miles worth of trackage and was used for a number of years, ultimately it closed down. The idea of the move to the north, of course, did begin to mature. They began to build this. They took advantage of some of the early logging railroads that had been built that we discussed in our series on lumbering, and they strengthened the trackage. They moved north to Muskogee and then began to build north toward the center of Mississippi, and they called this the Pensacola, Alabama, and Tennessee Railroad, the PAT. That railroad, by the way, would have 3 or 4 different names before it was ultimately tagged. But as we proceeded with the story, through the 1880s, into the 90s, and then early into the 20th century, that railroad was moving ahead just a little bit at a time. And of course, by now, they had another dream, because not only was there the opportunity there for general transport, by now the movement of coal for use by steamships and for industrial use and for shipping coal through the port of Pensacola, this was now becoming a great opportunity. So one of the things that they wanted to do with the PAT and the other railroad linkages there was to run that line with a branch into the Alabama coal fields, which indeed they did. So that by the time we reached the middle 1890s, this could be tied in with the L&N system coming down, which by the way, the P&A had now become called took on the name of the L&N. Now they were able to build a line that would come out of Alabama's coal fields, straight south, come into Pensacola, pass through the freight yard, which the L&N had built right in the very center of the city, and then a track would run down to the southeast to 14th Avenue, and they built there what was called a coal tipple. This was a long 1,600-foot dock, basically, long enough and serviceable enough for 6 vessels at a time, and this is where the coal came in and where the ships would dock, first for their own fuel for bunkers, and of course a lot of the coal was being shipped for industrial purposes in the Caribbean islands. So we had railroads building to the north, we had railroads building to the east. Pensacola itself was growing in large measure because of the railroad. Now, to house a lot of these people, this was becoming kind of a railroad center. The L&N built a village that was for the railroad people themselves. They called it Bohemia, and it was on the east side of Pensacola, just about, basically there is an upscale subdivision there today. And we'll talk a little bit more about Bohemia and the people who worked here when our next episode is shown.